minions, welcome to Crank It Up. This is the Postmortem for Game 28, featuring Killer Plant Truckers versus Giant Ant Pirates. If you've seen the results, you know that Giant Ant Pirates won both games and they will be advancing to the Final Four. I had Disco Dancing Dinosaurs winning this matchup, but clearly that wasn't going to happen because they weren't playing. When I picked that matchup, I was based against playing Killer Plant Truckers, which I really do think they would have beaten. But Killer Plant Truckers versus Giant Ant Pirates is interesting for an entirely different reason. Now, even though Giant Ants won both games, I do think that it's plausible that Killer Plant Truckers could have advanced this match, but I don't think that they were favored to. I think it's probably around the 35%, 40% chance of winning. The reason is, while they have some tools to deal with the Giant Ant Pirates, they're pretty unconventional, and in some cases, they're very slow. So what can we do to stop the infinite first mate, which actually happened to me in game first one? Well, they have two main tools. The first one is Choking Vines, a killer plant action, which is incredibly slow. Choking Vines can destroy any minion, which is powerful, but it does so at the start of your next turn. This is to make it different from Assassination, which destroys at the end of the current turn. Now, that's unfortunate, because what it means is you have a chance to respond to it as the opponent, especially in 1v1. And that's exactly what Blackjack did when I played on him in the first game. Knowing that that first mate was going to die, he decided to remove all the counters for it and draw a bunch of cards. If there's one thing the Giant Ant Pirates don't have, it's card draw, because the card draw that they get from Who Wants to Live Forever would actually remove many of their counters that they need in order to go infinite in the first place. But if the minion is going to die, why not draw the counters? And that actually speeds up their deck quite a bit, because it makes sure that they get to their key cards. You can get the counters, but without We Will Rock You or a Kind of Magic, you're very unlikely to go infinite, and by speeding that up in any mechanism, it's really going to help. That's one counter that they have, but it's easily mitigated because you can remove the counters. Additionally, because they actually do not destroy the minion until the start of my turn, I have a chance to react another way as Giant Ant Pirates, and that's with the Show Must Go On. Now, this is something that a lot of people might not be aware of, even though we made it known to both players, just because I had brought this up a lot and people were confused by it, but it's completely supported by the rules. And that is what I call the retroactive action defense. What the rules state is that an action that is currently attached to a minion, if it can no longer affect the minion, then you can't just have the action on it anymore, you have to discard it. In other words, if I play Choking Vines on a minion, let's say I play it on a first mate that has a power counter. If I play the Show Must Go On at a later time, minions with power counters cannot be affected by other players' cards. That will actually discard the action on it, because it can't affect it. And even though the destruction is in effect, so is the simple effect of being attached to it, and that will remove it after the fact. In rare circumstances that ends up being very meaningful, I mentioned that it could be meaningful against Cyborg 8 Musketeers and Russian Magical Fairy Tales, but it definitely matters against this combination, because it can remove Choking Vines after the fact, which would be incredibly annoying. So even though they do have one counter against Giant Ant Pirates, Killer Plant Truckers suffer because Giant Ants have two ways of countering it right back. The second, much more interesting card is one that is very situational, but matters a lot against this team, and that's Entangled. Entangled states that minions cannot be moved from any base where you have a minion. And the return to hand part doesn't really matter against this team, but as far as the movement, that matters incredibly against first mates. Now, there's a couple of nitpick details where Entangled needs to be on a separate base. The thought process being that if Entangled is an ongoing ability and it gets removed, it no longer can affect anything. That's debatable, but that's how it's been ruled in the past. But if you can put it on another base, then it's, irrefutable. The idea is that you can't, if you have a minion on that Entangled base, then the first mates cannot actually move. If you have a minion on the first mate base, because of they can't move any base where you have a minion. The first mate can no longer move. That would actually trap him, and force him to go to the discard pile, which would really nullify the infinite first mate by taking them off the board entirely. It could be very powerful. And this came so close to actually happening. It's very hard to pull off, because the best way to actually do it is to do it on your turn. In 1v1, you have only 2 opportunities for it. The turn that you play it and your opponent's turn. And your opponent knows that that card is in play. Why are they going to break the base and destroy their own first mates? They're not going to do it. So the best chance to do it is on your turn, but it's also costing you your action, which means that you need to still manage to break the base in other ways. And movement is a great way of doing that, ironically. What you do is you do all your movement and your minion plays up front, and then you play the action. If you have El Bandito out, he can play an extra action on a base. That's a great way of doing it. That way you can use either an Instagrow or a Blossom or Convoy or anything that generates a lot of power in order to try and win the base, and then play Entangled to try and strap the first mate there. Of course, when you're in a desperation situation, you may be inclined to lose the base, but win the war by getting the first mates out of the playing field, which is what I was going for. And with Water Lily, at the start of my turn, I was really hoping that I would draw Entangled, and I didn't. And I was incredibly frustrated that it was the next card. Literally, if I had just drawn one more card over the course of the game, it could have been an entirely different story. Giant Ant Pirates can lose. They have had a very good run so far, and to some extent, they deserve to be in the Final Four, but I have to admit that they managed to have a very good series of matchups in that there are a lot of counters. I mentioned this a couple of times, that I had seeded them 18 because I counted at least 17 teams that I really did not want them to play because they would lose in a heartbeat. And they got dealt a massive favor by Killer Plant Truckers eliminating Star Roaming Aliens. If they were playing Star Roaming Aliens, I don't think they have a chance at all. The second you get a bunch of counters, I'm going to beam that up. I will terraform, I will do whatever I can to make your life miserable. Crop circles will be incredibly powerful and stall significantly. There's no way that Giant Ants win that matchup, in my opinion. But they weren't facing Star Roaming Aliens, they were facing Killer Plant Truckers. How can Killer Plant Truckers beat Star Roaming Aliens, but not Giant Ant Pirates, when both of those teams seem like ticking time bombs? Well, obviously overgrowth is going to be a factor, but it's interesting because overgrowth really wasn't a factor in either game. But I also wonder what would have happened if it were, because you have the first mates. The first mates can follow where overgrowth is going. The best way to counter overgrowth if you can't destroy it is to break that base on your turn and win it and get it out of play. That's something that happened in Game 3 against the Polynesian Voyager Explorers, although they were able to play it again with Fixing to Fix It. I don't know that you had the luxury of that time against Giant Ant Pirates because, at some point they're going to go Nova and they're going to do the thing. One game ended in an infinite, the other game didn't, and that's not surprising at all because Killer Plant Truckers, people may have doubted them early on, but they've proven that they can win with and without overgrowth. I think they would have had a little bit more of an advantage with overgrowth, but they still have a number of good cards. They can slow you down with Sleep Spores to give themselves more time. When you think about it, every power matters, and the Giant Ant Pirates are timing based because they're playing Will Will Rock You. If they don't have the power, even if you're just negating them the slightest bit, then it means that a base may not actually score, a base that you're not even on necessarily, and that could mean that they can't go infinite. It's not the greatest counter in the world, but it does matter. They could also just spam minions very quickly and try and break bases as quickly as possible. With their card draw, it's much more consistent. They have a chance to make some big plays if they draw into their good cards. It just didn't happen. And like I said, they weren't really favored to win this matchup anyway. So it's not a surprise that Giant Ants would be going on. For those who are curious, the reason why I bet on dinos to win against Killer Plant Truckers was because what I would do is I would wait for overgrowth to be played, saving my good cards because they can break bases incredibly quickly. Whether or not I win or lose, it doesn't matter. If I'm doing King Rex Rampage for a loss, I'm okay with that, even though I don't think it would result in a loss. And I would just be like, you play Overgrowth, fine. That base is gone next turn. Here's a Diva Augmentation copy play. Here's a King Rex Rampage play. Get Overgrowth out of the way. Make the two teams compete on their normal power levels. And I think Disco Dinos would take it in that circumstance. This is one of the things that's interesting about March Smashness with betting forward, because you don't really know who's going to play. A surprise elimination, from the perspective of many people, like Star Warming Aliens being eliminated, really changes a matchup. Giant Ant Pirates, you wouldn't have thought that they would advance. Now all of a sudden they're not facing a hard counter, and they will advance after all. They'll be facing Cyborg 8 Musketeers in the Final Four. That's another fast faction that again has very little counters. The only counter that they have is Monkey on their back, and there's a specific time that they have to play it because it only destroys a minion of power 4 or less. Will that be enough to slow down the Giant Ant Pirates? We'll find out in 2 days. That's the postmortem for Game 28. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you tomorrow for the first postmortem of the Final Four. Let's shut it down.